Rakhshanda Jalil. Rakhshanda ji, has she reached? I know there was a bit of a transport flap this morning for her. Has Rakhshanda ji reached? You're here? Okay, super. So I invite on stage Arundhati Subramaniam and Rakhshanda Jalil. The topic for today is Women Who Wield the Word, an anthology of sacred poetry of, by and for women, transcending religion and time, and a living Pakistani poet's deep insight into the human condition and social and political realities of our age and region. Poetry, divine and mortal. The interlocutor for this session is Nirupama Dutt. Please may I have our panelists and the interlocutor on stage. Nirupama ji, can we have you on stage? Do you have enough mics? I've got one. This one is there. Hi Niru, finally I'm
देर लगी आने
Where
में
do you want
उनको
us to sit? Where are you
They
sitting?
have a which
Can we have a round of applause for our panelists and our interlocutor for today? Thank you.
I'm fine. I was so thrilled with this session. So we are here with women who wield words, poetry, stories, translation, and so much more. And it is such a happy moment for me to have Arundhati Subramaniam, who is the poet writing in English, and not just writing in English. She has brought forward the poetry across languages to the world by the Indian writers. Winner of the Sahitya Academy Award, and so many other awards, including the first Khushwant Singh Memorial Award for Poetry. And we have here her book, Wild Women. You know, it says it all. And, of course, there is Rakhshanda Jalil here, who in the past few years has done remarkable work, a writer, a translator, and she has spoken of love in the times of hatred. And that has been something very remarkable. And I'm carrying her book because I wanted to celebrate both the books. This is a translation, her latest mint fresh book of Zehra Nigar, the famous Urdu poet from Pakistan. And it is called The Story of Eve. Please remember both these books, they are collector items. And of Rakhshanda, I must say that it has been very intense work which she has done, over 25 books. And talking of the times we are living through, not by giving a lecture or by, you know, making some hypothesis, but through literature. She has, and before I start conversing with them, let me recite a little poem in their honor, because today we are talking of women who love, you know, women who are bold, women who speak for themselves, who know how to wield words, women who love. The poem, of course, is in Punjabi, but close to Hindustani. ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੇਰੇ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਆਓਗੇ ਤੇ ਬੁਰੀਆਂ ਔਰਤਾਂ ਦੀ ਫਹਿਰਿਸਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰਾ ਨਾਮ ਵੀ ਦਰਜ ਪਾਓਗੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਉਹ ਸਭ ਕੁਝ ਹੈ ਜੋ ਇੱਕ ਬੁਰੀ ਔਰਤ ਕੋਲ ਹੋਣਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਲਾਜ਼ਮੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਉਹ ਸਭ ਕੁਝ ਹੈ ਜੋ ਇੱਕ ਬੁਰੀ ਔਰਤ ਕੋਲ ਹੋਣਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਲਾਜ਼ਮੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਮੂੰਹ 'ਚ ਬਲਦੀ ਅੱਗ ਹੈ ਦਿਲ ਧੜਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਥਿਰਕਦੀ ਮੇਰੀ ਰਗ ਰਗ ਹੈ ਹੱਥ ਵਿੱਚ छलकदा जाम है, मेरा खिलंडरी हासा बड़ा बदनाम है, मेरे कोल सहन दा हौसला है, मेरे कोल कहन दा सामान है। जे तुसी मेरे शहर आओगे ते बुरियां औरतां दी फहरिस्त विच मेरा नाम भी दर्ज पाओ। So Arundhati, let's begin with this book titled Wild Women and what went into the making of this book.
Thank you, Niru, and thank you all for being here. Wonderful to be with two amazing women, two wild women in their own right. And I can't think of really better people to be having this conversation with. For me, Wild Women is a book that has probably been in the making for as long as I can remember. But it arose, it began to take shape around 6 years ago when a question recurred for me. I'm an omnivorous reader of all manner of spiritual literature, from St. John of the Cross to Hafiz and Basho and Nammalwar, Kabir, all of it. But the question for me that recurred was, where are the women? Where on earth are the women? And I found that there is a handful that many of us know of in this subcontinent. We know of Mirabai. We know of Andal in the south. Some of us know of Akka Mahadevi in Karnataka. Some of us know of Laldev in Kashmir. But I found that these women have largely been flattened into calendar art. They've been steamrolled into plaster sainthood. And I wanted to read of women who are not just women who've turned into little puffs of vapor. I wanted women of blood, women with bodies, women with their own bewilderments, women who speak of hungers, women who speak of hormones. I wanted real women. So part of this project really was about reclaiming for myself many of these women who have been defanged to my mind by religious and rationalist narratives. They've been overlooked, they've been marginalized, and about hearing them afresh for myself. And the other part of it was also about tuning into all those voices that I never knew existed. There are legions of women in this subcontinent, and if at all we hear of them in terms of their own regional following, we hear of them only as decorative songsters. We hear of them as disciples, groveling disciples. We don't hear of them as ancestors, as foremothers, as pioneers, as trailblazers. We don't hear of them as women of spine and nerve. And that's what I wanted to hear, really. I wanted to smell the danger again. And that's how Wild Women took shape.
And did this book, while you were working on it, bring any surprises for you too?
Innumerable surprises, really. For me, I realized at the start that my guiding principle was going to be plurality. So I wanted women who were as diverse as possible. So there are in this book Vedantins, and there are Bhaktas, and there are Tantrikas, and there are Sufis, and there are Buddhists, and there are women who are monastic, there are women who are householders, there are women who are mendicants, travelers, solo travelers. Two of them, as we know, even walked the world naked, Akka Mahadevi, Laldev. And then there are women in this book who are also courtesans. And to me, they bring something very singular into the poetry. So on the one hand, you have the Buddhist nuns clad in ochre. On the other hand, you have Akka Mahadevi, who talks of shedding all cultural restraint. And then you have someone like Tarigonda Venkamamba, who says, although she's a widow of the 18th century in Andhra Pradesh, She chooses to wear colored apparel. She chooses to wear vermilion. She chooses to flaunt her intellectual brilliance. And when she's taken by the scandalized elders and asked to bow before the religious pontiff of her times, she refuses. And when they insist, she asks him to rise from his seat, and she bows before the empty seat. And in a wonderful, probably apocryphal story, we are told that the seat itself went up in flames. My question is, why had I never heard of Tadigonda Venkamamba? How had I missed a woman like this? A woman with this kind of temerity? So as I said, you have the women who wear their ochre, you have the women who wear nothing at all, you have Tadigonda Venkamamba and so many others. There are the Kannada Vachana poets, there are the Saurashtra women poets of Gujarat, many of whom had husbands who were also their spiritual companions. And then you have the courtesan poets. Most of us have heard of Amrapali, the beautiful Amrapali immortalized in that film with Vaijayantimala. Amrapali, 2,500 years ago, leaves us a poem in which she speaks not of the beautiful body. Amrapali speaks of the aging body. And she looks down at this body. She's an old woman looking down at her body. She speaks of it with heartbreak, but she also speaks of it with pride. And to me, it was important to hear that pride as well. So there is, perhaps my favorite is this woman called Sule Sankava. This was a big surprise. Sule Sankava is a 12th century prostitute poet who wrote in Kannada, in the Vachana tradition. Sule Sankava says, the men of my time, they're not terribly surprising. My relationship with them is transactional. But my God, she says, my God is Nirlajeshwara, the God without shame. I can approach him without a shred of doubt, without a shred of humiliation. This is no longer a God whom you have to purify yourself in order to reach. This is a God who will get his hands soiled in the business of samsara to reach you. So to me, this is what the women bring, this understanding of the body, reminding us that all these hierarchies that we still live by, pure, impure, high, low, all these are just constructs. And Soirabai, the Dalit poet of the 14th century in Maharashtra, tells us, if menstrual blood makes me impure, tell me who was not born of that blood. Why have we forgotten Soirabai? Why did I not grow up learning of Soirabai? To me, these were the questions that stayed with me. Or there's someone, and perhaps I should stop here, but I want to just quote the last poem, and maybe we can talk about this further later. I don't want to monopolize the time. But there is Janabai, the utterly astounding 13th century mystic of Maharashtra. By profession, Janabai is a maid servant in the house of a celebrated mystic called Namdev, whom many of us know of. But Janabai's relationship with her God is that of a backslapping friend and confidant. So when Janabai is tired, God does the dishes. When Janabai is exhausted, God washes her hair. Which is why Janabai is able to say in this poem translated by Arun Kolatkar, which I will read to you. It's one of my favorites in the book. There are many others too, but let me read you this one. She says, I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within, God is without, and what's more, there's God to spare.
Beautifully put. We come back to you, and I go to Rakhshanda. And the latest book, before we talk of much other that she's done, Uh, Zahra Nigar, very famous Urdu poet. And the book is interestingly called The Story of Eve. One little story which I've heard her curtsy these Sark poetry exchanges, but one story about her which is very famous, that the first Indo-Pak Mushaira in Karachi, when it was held long ago, a young girl got onto the stage and said, आशियाने की बात करते हो, किस ज़माने की बात करते हो? And the entire audience was stunned, and because everyone had gone through that. Rakhshanda, before we move forward with the book, would you like to introduce Zahra Nigar to us in the...
Thank you, Niru. First of all, I want to say that it takes a brave Litfest organizer, and maybe it's very appropriate that the Khushwant Singh Litfest is making space for a book like this. We live in times where anything to do with Pakistan is almost a dirty word. It took a brave publisher like Speaking Tiger to publish an Urdu woman poet from Pakistan, and it took Nilufar Billi Moria. It took Nilufar virtually no persuasion to get me to come here and talk about this. Later in the day, I'm talking about my other book, but this is special. And it's special for many reasons. Yes, there are things here that Zahra Nigar talks about her world, a world which is somewhat different from ours. We are fortunate in India, we don't have boy soldiers being blown up by minefields. She talks of those. She talks of little girls going to schools in poems like Qissa Gul Zamina Ka, about little girls whose schools have been bombed and who are being stopped by the Taliban from attending schools. She talks of other things, however, which are common to us here in India too. She talks of female feticide. She talks of segregation of the sexes. But more importantly, I think what really struck a chord with me was this fine line that many of us walk between feminism and femininity, and how it is entirely possible to use a very feminine idiom and vocabulary to talk of the world we live in. यानी जिसको कहते हैं घरेलू जुबान, घरेलू लहजा. तवे पे रोटी जल गई, एक औरत मिट्ठू मियाँ को बोलना सिखा रही है. And then, in the midst of all that, in that very pastoral, very घरेलू माहौल, what does she introduce? She introduces the rape of women in their homes in the country that would become Bangladesh by East Pakistani forces. And yet the story begins in a very gentle way, invoking a very, very domestic idiom and imagery. And suddenly it becomes a very political poem. And this she does time and time again. Yeah. So the reference that you, Niru, started with, as a very young woman, Zahra Nigar would come on stage, very demurely recite her poetry and then scuttle off stage, because this was a space, the Mushaira space, which was an entirely male-dominated space. And she says this was a Muhajir family that had moved from Hyderabad, India, to Pakistan, and poets were paid rather well to read their poetry at Mushaira. She needed that money. She would go, she would recite her poetry, and then she would just get off stage, because this was a space that was not welcoming to women. It took 40, 50 years for women, and today we have very large numbers of women reading their poetry from a public platform. But people like Zahra Nigar have been out there. When you talk of feminine écriture, you talk of the work that has been done in a seemingly very simple, almost demure manner, but nevertheless, behind the demureness was, you know, real work, very substantial work. If you permit, Niru, I want to read a very short poem which kind of sets the tone for the book. And the things that I'm talking about, this whole business of feminism and femininity, I think it comes out in a very short poem, which is also the title poem. And because we are here in Kasauli, I sense that many of you would understand the Urdu. So if you permit, I will read the Urdu and also read the English.
Wonderful, wonderful. Please do.
So this is called हव्वा की कहानी. तुम्हें सेब खाने की तरकीब मैंने नहीं दी थी. वो गेहूं का दाना मेरी दस्तरस में नहीं था. मेरी सांप से दोस्ती भी नहीं थी. अगर दोस्ती थी, वो तुम थे. अगर कोई अच्छा लगा था, वो तुम थे. This is Eve talking to Adam. The story of Eve. This is the translation. I did not compel you to eat the apple, nor was that grain of wheat grown on my palm. And the serpent, he was no friend of mine. If I had a friend, it was you. If I loved someone, it was you.
Could we listen to one or two more?
One more, certainly, happily. Let me read another, which is which speaks to many women. It's called Samjhauta. मुलायम गर्म समझौते की चादर, ये चादर मैंने बरसों में बुली है. कहीं भी सच के गुलबूटे नहीं हैं, किसी भी झूठ का टांका नहीं है. इसी से मैं भी तन ढक लूंगी अपना, इसी से तुम भी आसूदा रहोगे. न खुश होगे न पजमुर्दा रहोगे, इसी को तान कर बन जाएगा घर. बिछा लेंगे तो खिल उठेगा आंगन, उठा लेंगे तो गिर जाएगा चिलमन.
Maybe have the translation.
Let's have the translation. You know, I've been translating from Urdu for years and years, 25 odd years. I work on the principle, don't know, Arundhati, if you agree with me as a translator, I think loss is inevitable. But if we as translators, if we as readers were to allow ourselves to be confined by the loss, then we would, to use an Urdu word, be mehroom. We would be bereft of so much in literature, not just world literature, but our own literatures across the South Asian continent. So yes, there is loss. And languages that are different, Urdu and English certainly are syntactically, the sounds and the silences are very different. So of course there is loss. So I think as a translator, I work on the principle that yes, there will be much that I will leave behind. And there are picket fences of languages that kind of, don't allow us to carry every nuance, every shade of meaning across that picket fence. But having said that, the gains too sometimes compensate. They open windows into other literary cultures, into other ways of seeing, into other ways of expressing. So, I'm conscious that there is a loss in what I translate, but do listen to this. It's called compromise. Warm and soft, this blanket of compromise. It has taken me years to weave it. No flowers of truth embellish it. Not a stitch of falsehood betrays it. It will do to cover my body, and it will keep you satisfied, although it will bring you neither joy nor sadness. Stretched overhead, it will make us a home. Spread beneath us, it will brighten up our courtyard. When we drop it, the screen will fall. And I think it speaks of marriage. It speaks of relationships between men and women. It speaks of the compromises that any relationship, it could be marriage, it could be any other relationship, that requires, and how women, I suppose, make the greater many of those compromises sometimes.
What interests me in the poems you have read, that there is an admission of the compromises. Yeah. Because very often when we make compromises, we negate them, That, no, it's not so, My man is not like this, My home is not like this. So what kind of a courage does this require, to live within the home, yet speak about it, speak about the man? This is what, and how you have seen it in the poetry of Zahra Nigar.
Actually, I'm struck by the last time I was here at the Kasoli Lit Fest. I was talking about a book that was new then for me. I just finished editing a collection of writings on Ismat Chughtai. That too was launched right here in Kasoli at the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival. And the book was called An Uncivil Woman, Writings on Ismat Chughtai. And in the course of the conversation with the moderator then, what came up, and I think which kind of answers your question, Niru, feminism is a work in progress. You know, it evolves, it changes with the generations. Ismat was considered a feminist in her time, but 50 years later, when I read Ismat, there's much in her that I find problematic. You know, it troubles me, it makes me anxious. It says, you know, where is this agency for the female body that someone like me or my daughters who are even greater feminists than me take for granted? Now, Zehra Nigar's feminism, I think, is different from a very young person in the 21st century. I think the idea of compromise would be very, very alien to a very young person starting out in life. Zehra Nigar's compromise is, especially this poem and what I understand of her, and I spotted Sayyida Appa sitting there in the audience, and she also knows, there she is, she knows Zehra Appa very well. And those of us who've met Zehra Nigar can say that, you know, feminism and femininity don't negate each other. Compromise does not take away or detract from a woman's strength. And somebody like Zehra Nigar, both in her poetry and in her personal life, exemplifies that in very many ways. That when you talk of compromise, you're not talking of, you know, तराजू के दो पल्ले, वो इक्वल होना इतना ज़्यादा शायद ज़रूरी नहीं है. कहाँ पे तरह दे जाना, कहाँ पे बात को छोड़ देना, और कहाँ पे अपनी जगह कायम रहना, अपनी पोजीशन को होल्ड करना, मेरे ख्याल से ये भी एक स्ट्रेंथ है. And this is something we need to learn, at least the younger feminists need to learn, you know, from this generation of women, you know, that इसमें भी मजबूती है, इसमें भी साबुतो सालिम रहने वाली एक क्वालिटी है, और ये कई जगह आता है इस किताब में.
Interestingly, my mother would call this tact. You know, living with tact, which was not acceptable to younger people, but very interesting. A little more on Zehra Nigar. How did you decide on her poetry, and did you have any personal interaction with her?
We have a common friend in Delhi, Mrs. Indira Verma, to whom this book incidentally is dedicated, who introduced me to her. And then we discovered, Zehra Appa and I discovered a generational friendship. She knew my family, and we began to, she's much older than me, but we began to understand, find common ground as women, as people who are interested in the world of literature, people who are interested in not just Urdu literature, but in other literatures. We began talking about cross-fertilization of ideas and sensibilities between literatures. I think that is important. जो भाषा के लिखने वाले लोग हैं, वो पंजाबी हो सकती है, वो हिंदी हो सकती है, उर्दू हो सकती है, हम एक खला में नहीं रहते, हम एक वैक्यूम में नहीं हैं. It can be any language. Arundhati, I wonder if you also feel this, that, you know, we need cross-fertilization between literatures and between literary cultures. Of course, translation is a valuable bridge, but I think conversations between languages. Sahitya Academy का जब Nehruvian India में when the foundation of the Sahitya Academy was laid, the one guiding principle was that it would provide a platform between languages. You know, unfortunately, somewhere that idea has leached out. In the sense, English has become the bridge. Why don't we have more conversations between a Tamil writer and an Urdu writer, or a Punjabi writer and a Malayalam writer? And why don't we have more of those conversations, those translations, without the bridge of a Hindi or an English, you know? So with Zehra Appa, we got talking about literary cultures, literary sensibilities, and how our other readings, how what we might have read from other languages intersects and influences our own writings, in whatever our language might be, in my case English, in her case Urdu. And so yeah, it started with that. And I remember doing a lovely long interview with her for the Hindu newspaper, and how a whole bunch of things came out, this business of feminism. And I asked her that if you are called up on stage to an audience where people don't know you, how do you react to being called a female poet? And nobody says a male poet. Why do you have to have this business of female added to a poet, a writer? I sort of don't see myself as a woman writer. I see myself as a writer. And yet I'm often introduced as a woman writer. I mean, I have no problem with my being a woman. That's not the point. The point is that you don't see, say, woman banker or woman this or woman that. Why? So when it comes to writing, why does our gender take center stage? And she answered in a very tranquil fashion to my very sort of agitated question. She says, कोई बात नहीं, कुछ चीज़ें जो हैं वो ज़रा accepted हो जाती हैं, वो tradition का हिस्सा हो जाती हैं. So I said, but tradition को भी तो question करने की ज़रूरत है. I mean, you know, do you see yourself as a female poet? So she thought, and she said, you know, I do use a feminine imagery. I do use an idiom that maybe a male poet wouldn't. Yes, I look at the world. Yes, I look at the unfairness, the inequality, the unevenness of the world. But yes, I think I employ an imagery which maybe a man wouldn't. So she kind of was very sanguine about it. And I think that is also knowing yourself as a writer and what are your strengths. But of course, that doesn't answer the question that still perplexes me, this business of gender and the extent to which it invades your writing.
What would you say about this? You know, in Hindi, it's very, there's a kavi and there's a kavitri. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think many other languages have this divide between the man writing and the woman writing. And as I came on the scene in the 70s of going to mushairas, listening, it used to be an all-male affair. And maybe one girl towards whom some male poet is favorable would be allowed to sit there, and she would recite something very docile. And she was accepted. Even in Hindi and Punjabi, of which I have direct experience, my generation women also had to pay a price for writing what they felt.
And they often sang Tarannum Se.
Tarannum Se, that was another thing, Tarannum Se. And how do you feel about this?
They're wonderful questions. It's good to be having this conversation. I'm not squeamish in any way about the idea, and I don't think any of us are, about the notion of feminism. I would have no problem calling myself feminist, or even a woman poet. But for me, let me clarify what I mean by feminist. I would say that for me, feminism is about interrogating the many ways in which gender is constructed. And as I keep questioning those ways, I'm discovering myself. And it excites me to encounter women who, in their own way, provoke those questions. These are wild women for me, and I love the idea of bringing up what makes women indecorous or wild. Someone asked me, 3 people have asked me so far, why wild women? And they're, of course, all male. Why wild? Because poetry, by definition, asks inconvenient questions. Poetry is a subversive activity. A really good poem will change the way we map our world. When it comes to sacred poetry, the finest sacred poetry is not goody-goody, antiseptic pieties about God. The finest sacred poetry questions the very hierarchy between the human and the divine. And so that makes it doubly dangerous. And when we come to women, we're in a zone that is triply dangerous, I believe, because when a woman finds her voice, the questions she asks become explosive. And to me, these are wild women because they ask inconvenient questions and then stake their lives on those questions. To me, that is very consonant with my understanding of what it means to be feminist. Feminism is not a straitjacket that you wear and say, I have arrived. It is a process of exploration. We are all works in progress trying to find out what it means to be Indian, what it means to be 21st century, what it means to be women, what it means to be men, what it means to be any other gender that we choose to describe ourselves as. We are all in the process of discovering ourselves. So to me, that spirit of discovery, if a label is used as a provisional label, I have absolutely no problem with it. I am a woman poet. I'm a 21st century poet. Sometimes I'm not a poet at all. But poet is a functional label. Woman is a functional label. I'm still finding out what it means to be me. So I would say that that's my response to your question. But I would also say, coming to these women, what excites me about poetry as a form is the fact that poetry is not about conclusions. You don't turn to poetry for ideological statements. You don't turn to poetry for full stops. You turn to poetry for the comma. You turn to poetry for the question mark. And you realize that you can be in the presence of a vast, cavernous pause that you do not dare fill with sound. That is the province of poetry. It's a molten utterance. To me, someone like this woman from the Teri Gatha, 2,500 years ago, for whom freedom means freedom from domestic drudgery. For me, she belongs as much as anyone else to this book. She says, free, free at last from mortar and pestle and crooked old husband. That's her freedom. But you also have, in the very same Teri Gatha, you also have Bhadda Kapilani, who has a perfectly happy marriage of many years with Kashyapa. And finally, the two of them decide to arrive at a mature, consensual decision to address their lives to the spiritual quest. This is a remarkable story of consensual decision-making between partners from 2,500 years ago. They both decide to part ways. One takes the road left, the other takes the road right, and they find their way to the same guru, the Buddha. But they find their own, they make their own journeys. To me, both belong, both are vital. And they're all reminders of the many, many ways in which each one of us can ask ourselves questions about what it means to be human and alive. The best poetry fills you with wonder. The best poetry fills you with bewilderment. The best poetry does not give you a headline, a tagline, an easy, glib understanding of the world. The best poetry will leave you perplexed, and that's fine. To me, this is what the greatest invitation is, an invitation to bewilderment. And if you are truly courageous enough to be bewildered, then you are certainly a wild one. The summons of the wild, if you truly hear the summons of the wild, as these women do, it often means refusing to barter your freedom for security, for respectability. There are male poets in this book too, in the second section, who give us women protagonists that we can never forget. Whether it's Annamacharya, whether it's Kabir, whether it's Shah Abdul Latif, they remind us that it is possible for women to set out on a journey from which success, on this journey, success means no return. And yet, they set out. Your username, your password is hacked, but you still want more. That's why they're wild women.
What did this bell mean? That 10 more minutes. Could we have a short read? 5 minutes? Okay, no. Rakhshanda, would you like to ask Arundhati something? And vice versa.
Which one is your favorite? How do you define wild in this? What was your qualifying criteria to make it into this selection?
I think essentially people who asked questions. And to me, it's not wild as opposed to, it's not wild as an uncivilized. It is wild as in a refusal to be domesticated. You may choose the householder life, but the finest poems tell us that the household, the kitchen, is a dangerous place. So when Akka Mahadevi says, take these husbands who die, decay, and feed them to your kitchen fires, it's not a kitchen you want to be in.
Yes.
Yes? Yes. Or when Lal Ded says, I pestled my heart in the mortar of love, I roasted it and I ate it up. You realize that this kitchen is a sacred laboratory in which a woman is both the experiment as well as the alchemist. This is a wild place as far as I'm concerned.
And vice versa, would you like to ask?
My question to you really is, what draws you? How do you decide whom you want to translate? Do you see, when you look back on your trajectory as translator, what is it, do you think, that has drawn you?
You see, first and foremost, people like us, we are literary translators. We are not commercial translators. We are not in the business of translating directions for a washing machine or a face bleach or what have you. So our translations are not commercial translations. They are not like a bank transfer from one account to another, from one vocabulary bank to another. So that is clearly not what we are doing. Also, there's a lovely Urdu word, farmaishi program. Yeah? So I'm not in the business of doing farmaishi program. Early on, I decided that I don't want to do these commission things where somebody pays me and say, "Hamare Nana ji ne badi achhi poetry likhi thi, please usko translate kar dijiye." I don't want to do that. I want to translate something that catches my fancy. It can be eclectic, it can be varied. In the past 25 years, it indeed has been very varied. So I've done a whole bunch of things, genres, people, you know, people very different. There's a Premchand, there's a Rashid Ahmed Siddiqui, there is a Manto, there is a Krishan Chandar, there's a Zehra Nigah, there is a Gulzar, there's a Javed Akhtar. So it's very varied. I quite like that variedness. It keeps you busy, you know. And also remember, I'm a freelance person. I'm not institutionalized. So I need variety in my personal life. I need something to catch my fancy and keep me going. फिर से मैं उर्दू का सहारा लेती हूँ. मुझे कुआं खोदना पड़ता है और अपनी प्यास बुझानी पड़ती है. तो मेरे लिए कोई कुआं खोद के तैयार नहीं करता है. So I have to find an interesting enough kuan to slake my thirst.
Just now, Rakhshanda, you spoke about Ismat Appa. And interestingly, she, along with Manto, had to, many would know, face trials of obscenity for her story Lihaf. And similarly, Manto had to face several trials. When the judgment finally came, the lawyer who defended both was Kapil Sibbal's father. Interestingly, Manto was let off finally, but Ismat Chugtai had to pay a fine of 50 rupees. So maybe a woman, you know, making a thing had to pay a little fine. But what I find happening now, though it's a little off the track from these books, is that Ismat's writing is being dismissed by many, and especially the feminists. Her story Lihaf is being reread in a different manner. How do you explain this?
I'm conscious that the bell has gone off, so I'll be as brief as possible. I think with women, the big problem I found is, and I've translated and worked on several, such as Rashid Jahan and others, the boldness of their persona, of their private life, overwhelms their literary output, and as it were, casts a very long shadow. And they are defined by their boldness rather than what they've written. And I think with Ismat, this happened very early on. Lehaf was published in 43, if I'm not mistaken, very early on in her career. And that defined her career. So anything else she wrote, which had nothing whatsoever to do with what Lehaf was concerned. And Ismat went blue in the face saying, I didn't even know that I was writing for the lesbian community. Of course, the term LGBTQ was not even there when she was writing. So now this story is taken up as a kind of an anthem for the LGBTQ community, but back then that was not her intention. So to answer your question, I think, Niru, sometimes with women this happens more so than with men, that what they do and say in their personal life, or any one thing that they might have done which is perceived as bold, it kind of overwhelms and overshadows everything else. And with her, indeed, that is what happened.
Maybe very short time, but a few questions, 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Anyone?
Let's have a brief, at least, lose the momentum.
Mike?
One question and then after.
Oh, we could have talked all